Here is a very simple question. Why is it that all throughout ancient histories, all over this planet, we have all of our ancient ancestors having gods related directly to planets? Why do they do this? Why is it that everywhere we go, it doesn't matter how far back we go or where we go on this planet, we find that everybody, for some weird reason, has this strange obsession with planets and gods. But for whatever reason, all of the gods are always related to a planet. Now, initially, this question might sound mundane and stupid, right? If you are classically trained, you've probably completely overlooked this aspect of ancient cosmology, right? You just take it for granted. You say, well, what do you mean? All of our ancient ancestors did it. I mean, I don't know, they just did it. That's what they did. They had nothing else to do back in the day, so they just stared up at the night sky and just named gods after other pinpricks of light that, they thought were planets or whatever. What even is this perspective? But this is the perspective that I know most classically trained people take. Even if you're on the alt side of research, there's a good chance that you have also not really looked at this particular position and really respected it for what it entails and what it means. I mean, think about that question. Why is it that all of our ancestors back in the day, and I mean like way ancient back in the day, I'm not talking like 500, 600 years ago. No, I'm talking thousands of years ago. Why is it that all of our ancestors have this insane story, or they have these mythologies that are absolutely crazy? I mean, they're just, all this crazy stuff is going on in the past. And while all this stuff is going on in the past, they relate everything to gods, right? I mean, so they blame the gods. So our ancestors were apparently all stupid, and they all thought, oh, well, there must be a god of earthquakes or something, and that god causes earthquakes because it's displeased with how we raised sheep, or whatever the hell's going on, right? Or they have, well, there's no rain this year, so that means this god was displeased with us because we didn't do enough cocaine. I don't know. I have no idea, right? I mean, there's all kinds of excuses that the mainstream gives us. The mainstream interpretations give us this kind of a perspective, right? I mean, the mainstream makes it sound like all of our ancient ancestors were just bumbling around, and then if something bad happened, they would just attribute it randomly to some god. And then for whatever reason, they would attribute it to a god, and then that god would be associated with a planet just because. I mean, why not, right? I mean, if we're going to be making up gods, god of like, I don't know, muffins or whatever, we might as well attribute it to a planet as well. I mean, it just seems normal. That's pretty logical, right? No, that is not logical. What the hell is this? This is the mainstream perspective. They read these translations. A lot of their translations are trash, by the way. But I mean, even the most basic translation, they just read this and they're like, well, they named a god after Venus. Venus was the god of fire or whatever, and we don't know why. Who cares? These people were dumb. And that's how the mainstream takes this. And the one question that should be asked, and that is never asked, is this an accurate interpretation of what these people back in the day were thinking and doing? I mean, is this really what they thought? Did they really think that, Fred, the god of dirt, was making it to where there was a drought? I mean, is that really what these people were thinking? These people who are building structures back in the day that are just mind-blowing, right? That have incorporated all these equations, all of this geological information. These buildings are amazing, but our ancestors are still stupid, and they still think that, Bob, the god of rocks, is, mad, so he starts throwing rocks to the earth or whatever. It's ridiculous. The whole concept is ridiculous, and it shows absolutely no respect for our ancestors. I mean, none, zero. I mean, that's okay. So this begs the question, why? Two questions, but the main question is, why did all of the ancient peoples in the past bother to create gods and then very specifically relate them to planets? I said two questions. Let's just stick with the one question. That's one question. Why did they do this? What was the point of making up a god and associating it with a planet? I mean, why would you do that? Would you do that? I mean, ask yourself that question. If you were, I mean, I've kind of already covered this once in a video before, but if you're outside at night, you know, and I say, hey, make up some gods and associate them with a cosmological body in the sky, right? If we're at night, the best you'll probably do is the moon, right? Everything else up in the sky is just a pinprick of light, right? You'd be hard pressed, any normal person would be hard pressed to look up at the night sky and be like, oh, that's a planet, and that's a star, and that's a star, and instantly tell the difference right there. Right? Most people cannot do this, and most people are not going to take their time to do this. It's just weird. You wouldn't do that. Now, you can come back right now and say, well, they were bored back in the day. I mean, they didn't have anything to do. They were just eating dirt and, you know, picking at tree bark. So the best they could do is they could look up at the sky, and they were like, yeah, that's a planet. Now that's the god of war. Really? Now, come on. That is not a realistic perspective. That is dumb. But at the end of the day, as a researcher, what are you left with? I mean, you are left with this explanation generally. And unfortunately, that's acceptable to most people, because most people do not like to fly in the face of a perceived authority. And the reality is, you know, the mainstream has a very false authoritative standing in the psyche of everybody who's studying, whether you like it or not. I mean, there's a good chance that you did not start your journey into ancient history by reading, I don't know, you know, some alternative history book. You probably didn't get that. Your first introduction to any kind of ancient history was more than likely, you know, a mainstream source. Now, some of that's not bad. I mean, some of the stuff, mainstream does have some good stuff here and there. There's still good people there. But overall, the vast majority of it is half-truths or just pure well-poisoning garbage. Right? But as you grow up with well-poisoned garbage, you know, affecting your psyche over decades, guess what happens, right? That perceived authority becomes a real authority, even if it's a false one. Even if you can scientifically prove that it's false, people will still look up to it. And that's where we find ourselves now in a lot of the historical studies we're dealing with. So what does this have to do with my initial question? Why did all of the ancients believe in gods and then relate those gods to a planetary body? Right? What the hell am I talking about? Well, here's the problem. So, as I've already kind of mentioned, when we see an ancient culture, you know, we read their history really quick, generally speaking. Or the first time you see a culture when you're initially starting your studies, you know, okay, fine, Mayans, you know, they worship Venus, or they're afraid of Venus for some weird reason. You know, these people are crazy, but they were cave people, right? You know, of course, I don't know, that's what they thought. They're crazy. Here's my question. Were they crazy, though? Were these people who were able to do all of this amazing stuff that we still have evidence for right now, right? And it's not just their buildings and their structures, it's also their cosmologies, their math, their physics, right? It's all there. We have, not all, it's not even close to all, but we have a lot of evidence to prove that a people like the Mayan, or maybe the Aztec, you know, it's, if we're talking true chronology and true civilization, it's hard to place a real name on who did what back in the time period. So I'm going to keep it, you know, generally just, you know, Mayan. Everybody kind of understands the Mayan or the Aztecs. We'll just I'll kind of say those. All right. That's actually a whole other discussion and part of history that I haven't even touched yet. We'll get to that eventually. Anyway, why the hell did all of these cultures care about planets? Right? As I just said, if I were to ask you to look up at the sky and try to pick out a planet to make, pick out a planet, period, not just, pick out a planet and relate it to a god, but if I say just find a planet, chances are good you're not going to be able to do that. So why is it that all of the cultures in the past did this? What was going on, right? I mean, if it was just one or two cultures that were looking up at the sky and doing this, fine. Okay, fine. You know what? Maybe they really paid attention to the sky and astronomy, as we have evidence they did anyways, or attempted to do. The mainstream would basically just say attempted, because all of the records for the ancient civilizations' cosmologies are all wrong relative to the cosmology of today. Now, that's a bullet point piece of evidence to stick a pin in, but let's keep going. So, why did Why, if we had only found, if we only had one or two civilizations looking up at the sky and doing this, fine, statistically, that's a possibility, okay? Maybe a couple of civilizations would have randomly, for whatever reason, related a planet that they watched, over years, going across the sky to a god, and that's their mythos. That would be fine if it was only one or two civilizations. We do not find one or two civilizations. We find all the civilizations, for some weird reason, decided to A, create gods. And as a side note, there is no law that demands that a civilization even create any kind of a god whatsoever. There is no reason for deism, theism, or any of that stuff. There is no natural law that says, yes, you must create a god of rice, right? There is nothing like that. For some weird reason, we find that's done everywhere. Now, if you're an atheist, you're probably now getting mad because you're probably thinking that I'm going to say, well, the gods are real. And of course, if God was real, then all the cultures would know it back in the day. No, that is not what I'm saying. I'm simply pointing out that the way that we nowadays look back at those civilizations or translate their texts, we translate certain aspects of their language as a god, because the other word in the translation that could be supplanting God doesn't make any sense. So when translators are translating certain works, when the word that a particular culture uses as God can also be retroactively used as the word planet. Now, depending on who's translating what text, so that's why you hear gods and planets constantly kind of being intertwined, because the translators, this is not the original people writing, but the translators are trying to translate the language to something that makes sense to us, right? So in a lot of cases, they use the word God in their translation, right? But more often than not, there's another word that works even better, and that's planet. So that's where we start to see this correlation of planet and God out of the translated texts. So this is actually an important thing to know and think about. Whenever you're reading a text, unless you know the exact language, unless you can literally speak those languages, which most people cannot, you're probably reading a translation that's in your native language, right? And of course, we lose things in translation, or translations necessarily have to be altered so that you can understand whatever they were talking about. So when a translator comes to a word in an ancient language that really does say planet, the context of the story doesn't make sense if you say planet. It will make sense if you use the term God, because God, or a god or whatever, is more magical and can do all the crazy stuff. If the original translation was the planet Venus, and the planet Venus is suddenly raining fire down on the earth, well, that doesn't really make sense to the translator now, does it? So the translator will instead translate that particular word as God instead of a planet. Now here is where we come to the problem. I know, all my schizo-babble. Let's get back to the main question, right? So, why did our ancestors worship gods? If we choose to face the reality that our ancestors were indeed discussing planetary movements, and they were. We know a lot of cultures all over the world were heavily embroiled in cosmology. In fact, many of them were obsessed with it to the point to where it ran their civilization. I mean, when was the last time you had cosmology run your life, right? I mean, the best you could really say right now is, well, I mean, the sun rules my life in the sense of it helps us keep time. So yeah, okay, you could say that, fair enough. But these people did not look up to these planets like that, right? They do not describe these gods and these planets as simple as that. Timekeeping definitely exists, and there's definitely a cosmology in most ancient cultures that handles that aspect, right? That is there. But the other side, or not other side, but the other part of it is the vast majority of the cosmologies of the ancients focuses on planetary movements and stuff going on in the sky. And it's not just planets that are moving around, right? I mean, we have huge meteors, moons, etc. I mean, there is a lot of stuff that these people are tracking back in the day. So what is going on? I mean, we don't have any of that stuff going on today, right? I mean, if we look at the cosmology of the Mayans or the Egyptians and we read it literally, which is what we should be doing anyway, if we read it literally, it paints a picture of just horror and destruction and malice and disease and just everything and war. All of this horrific stuff is constantly happening at the behest of gods. And as I've just kind of gone over, we can a lot of the times, not always, but a lot of the times, you can switch the translation of God with planet. This is a 100% legitimate switch because the translation can be translated like that. So you might be saying, fine, you can do that, and it is done, right? That's where the discrepancies with gods and planets kind of comes into play relative to us nowadays, right? Because when we are reading these translations, the translators have ascribed, a lot of the stuff towards gods, but sometimes they can't ascribe certain passages to the word God, and they have to use the planetary name, right? They have to use the term planet, because that's the only other way it makes sense. So, what does this do for us? What kind of position does this put us in? Well, what it does is that it devalues all of the hard work that our ancient ancestors did to record all of the stuff that they went through, all of their observations, all of the horrific events that they hopefully survived. A lot of cultures didn't survive some of this stuff, but they still went out of their way to record things, and at least the survivors of the people that did record tried to carry on the tradition, right? So if we ascribe all those crazy events to gods, what that does is it invalidates all of those hard-earned and hard-written histories. Now, there's probably not too many of you out there who are looking to disrespect anybody's ancient culture, specifically your own. But when you look at these ancient histories and these ancient stories, it's tough to reconcile any of that stuff with reality, right? So I don't blame anybody for not taking these things seriously. I was in that exact same boat. I was right there. I didn't figure this stuff out on my own, not at all. But does that mean that we can't take these things seriously? Does that mean that we cannot look at these events through another light? And that's the point of this talk. I know it took me like 12,000 hours to get to the point. And that point is our ancestors were not recording the actions of gods. Our ancestors were recording the actions of planetary bodies in the sky. It's not even hidden from us. I think that's like probably the worst part about this whole thing, is that there is nothing hidden. Our ancestors very plainly state that Venus, they saw Venus in the sky. They saw it. They knew what it looked like. Our ancestors very plainly describe Mars. They know about the scar on Mars. They are well aware of Valles Marineris. Not only, for example, are they aware of that huge scar on Mars, they even know how it got the scar. They describe it. Now, when we start replacing the word God with planet, suddenly all of our ancestors' stories start to make actual scientific sense. Now, what does this mean? So I just said that our ancestors should have had to have been able to see Mars, for example. I mean, you cannot see Valles Marineris with the naked eye, right? You can't do it. You probably can't even find Mars on your own. So what that means is that our ancestors had a different way of seeing the planets. Now, does that mean they had some sort of super high technology and they were just watching the planets for whatever reason? No, we have no reason to believe they were running around with crazy telescopes. We have no evidence for that. What we do have evidence for is that the planets were simply closer to Earth during certain periods of time. Now, I get it. This is going to sound crazy initially. But the reality is, if we take what our ancestors are saying at face value, and we are replacing the word God with planet, which is basically the answer to this whole video, so you can shut this off now unless you want to keep listening. But if we start replacing the word God with planet, all of those stories start to have a real world bearing. those stories will now start to make sense in a true sense and not in some sort of a mythological legend type of sense, which is the way all of that stuff is portrayed, right? Apparently, all of our ancestors only had time to write fiction, and they could never write actual history. I mean, that is the mainstream's perspective. That's what they do. They think everybody back there was just a fiction junkie, I guess. I don't know. I mean, why else would you believe that that's all they wrote about? No. All of our ancestors were writing about what they saw, right? And we've lost a ton of those writings, but what has survived is more than enough to show us that it was extremely important for them to record these events. In fact, it's really telling, actually, that out of all the documents that we have guaranteed lost to time, I mean, they're just gone, that what we find that survives are these kinds of stories, right? We don't find gobs and gobs of just, garbage history, like basic history. We do not find tomes and tomes of, basic mundane stuff. We do not find that, right? If that was the kind of history that ancient civilizations were recording, then statistically we would find more of that over the fiction, the quote-unquote fictional stuff, right? But no, what do we find in everybody's history that survives? All of this planetary movement stuff is what survives, right? This means, statistically, that this is what was being written about most, and if this was being written about most, it must have been important. Not just to one or two civilizations, but to all of them. So if all civilizations, if all they're recording is this kind of stuff, if all we're seeing is, rocks falling from the sky and, bitumen falling from the sky and continents sinking and, earthquakes that just defy reason and lightning bolts, going between planets like crazy. If this is what they're describing and this is what survives, this is what must have been mainly written about, right? Why would all these cultures focus solely on fiction if that's what this was, right? I mean, do you honestly believe that that's all of the stuff that would survive from all these cultures would be? No. What's going to survive is what's mostly written about, right? Because we're going to lose stuff. So whatever did survive is probably what was the number one thing that mattered. Now, if all of this kind of crazy stuff took place, this would matter, right? I mean, if you had to deal with planetary bodies in your sky, that would be one hell of an experience. And that would definitely be something that any civilization would go out of its way to record for several reasons. Actually, let's get into that. The first reason is just because how mind-numbingly insane it would be. I mean, this would be humbling. In fact, it would be so humbling, it would be like being in the presence of a god. I mean, it might as well be. I don't think a lot of people understand that. So, for example, if we were to take the moon right now, let's just take the moon, and all of a sudden the moon was coming closer to Earth. And you could watch that. Like every night you watch and you could visually see and watch the moon approach the Earth. I promise you would psychologically feel an entirely primal resonance that you never thought existed in your life. Why? Because here's what's going on. If the moon is coming and might very well smash into the Earth, right? You're watching it. It's right there. Here's the thing. A human has nothing to stop that. There is nothing in any form of imagination or anything that can possibly stop a planetary body, or at least that a human can do, to stop a planetary body from colliding into another one on that scale. There's nothing you can do. It doesn't matter all the technology, all the internet, all the TikTok you watch, all the Facebook you scroll through, all the Twitter you waste your time on, all irrelevant. And you would feel that to the core of your very being. I promise. And that sensation would feel probably just like being in the presence of a god. And this is why the translators translate these passages as a god instead of a planet. Because the way that these things are spoken about, not just about what they're doing, but how they're spoken about, I mean, you may as well be in the presence of a god. This is the kind of feeling that would happen to you or wash over you if you had to deal with this kind of a situation. You would be humbled to the core, and I mean to the primal core. The reality is there's probably not that much on Earth right now that can do that to you. Maybe some natural disasters. I'm sure, hey, like a tidal wave, being in the way of a tidal wave would probably be an okay one, but it's not the same thing. When you have a giant planetary body coming close to the planet, That's an entire other kind of destruction. A tidal wave, you understand, right? Yeah, I could get washed away, I would drown, I'm going to see some buildings collapse. But, and you can quantify that. As a human, you can understand that on a pretty fundamental level. And while it's still awesome, it's not as impressive as a planetary body threatening to smash into Earth, right? Because there's nothing you can do about that. That's it. You and everyone around you are done. There's no amount of digging that's going to save you, right? Doesn't matter where you go. If another planet were to smash into Earth, you're done. So it might as well be like living in the face of a god. So that's where that reverence comes from. That's where that awe-inspiring writing comes from, because that is the exact kind of feeling you would get from that situation. Now, the second reason why you would record this kind of stuff is simply to pass that on to future generations, right? If your civilization survives this, or if it doesn't, but let's say the planet Earth survives it, if you can leave some kind of a record for the future generations to where they can look out for the signs that a horrible planetary collision event might take place, maybe in the future they can do something about it. You would record all of this history for posterity for that reason alone. And what's interesting is that is literally why a lot of the ancient cultures recorded this stuff. They recorded this stuff to hand it down, to be like, you need to watch out for this, right? There's a lot of cultures that didn't survive this stuff. They still recorded it to the best of their ability, but they're gone. And to ignore this stuff, to ignore these warnings, we do that sort of at our own peril. I don't know what we could do if a planetary body was approaching us again. I mean, we're kind of screwed, but you get my point, right? You would at least make an attempt to try to convey the message to future generations. And that was done. What kind of sucks now is that we have this information, but we now look at it as fantasy. Now, why do we check this stuff out as fantasy? Because it's all so unbelievable. Because in today's day and age, we have absolutely no reference point for any of this stuff, right? The moon is not threatening to hit planet Earth. Venus and Mars are not threatening, Earth's orbit in any way, shape, or form. Jupiter's not doing anything to Earth. Saturn does not matter. None of this stuff is happening. In fact, what's really interesting is that our current timeline that we're in, our current year, we are in one hell of a peaceful time, which actually explains why we have the kind of population we do, why we've been able to generate the kind of tech we built, etc., because we have not been bombarded by, comets, asteroids, earthquakes, tidal waves, constantly on like in a planetary scale. It's not happening nowadays. So that's one of the reasons why humans have been able to get to the point to where we're at right now, is because we don't have those things wiping out entire continents anymore. Something to think about. That's actually another talk for a different time. All right, I've talked long enough. You get the point. I think you get the point. Well, here's the point. Every time you start reading an ancient text, every time you start doing any kind of ancient historical research and you're running into the term God, switch that term God out with the word planet, and then reread the story, and then watch all of that story suddenly make sense. Right? And then once you tie in all the archaeological evidence, all the geological evidence, all the cosmological evidence, man, those stories really come to life. So I highly recommend rereading that stuff. Just switch out the term God with planet, because these people, they weren't talking about a sky daddy, right? So here you go, atheists. They did not believe in a God in that sense. That kind of stuff comes later, in the later generations, when after a while, everybody forgets what happened. See, that's another interesting thing about human psychology. Humans will just forget things, right? If something is not happening all the time, you just lose focus of it, right? Out of sight, out of mind. If something is out of sight, out of mind for generations or thousands of years, right, you completely lose it. It's gone. If it was not recorded in some sort of state of posterity that can survive the ages, it's done. It's gone. So that's also something to remember while you're doing this. If you're wondering, well, shouldn't we know about this? It's not that old. Yeah, we should know about it. And technically we do. We do. The only reason why we don't take it seriously is because we have been trained to not take it seriously. Take what these people say seriously. When they say that oil rained down and literally created floods of oil in, the Mexico area, believe it. Right? Where could it have come? Well, we know there are hydrocarbons now on planets. It's entirely possible that hydrocarbons could have rained down on Earth. There's nothing wrong with that. There's nothing unscientific about that. Another topic as well for discussion, all that stuff. My point is that when you start seeing all these weird things happening in the past in these stories, go look at the geological evidence. When you look at geological evidence, a side note here, stop injecting millions and billions of years into things. You don't need to do that. The millions and billions of years thing, geologists have no frame of reference for that either. They only say that because they've been told to say it, and their BS ways of measuring that stuff, it's all garbage. So don't worry about all that stuff. Go look at like newer geology. Go check out electric universe geology. Holy crap, plasma physics geology. That stuff will set you straight immediately. Anyway. But as you're reading these stories, go look at the sciences around it. Go look at the geology. Go look at the cosmology. If somebody says there's a god, the god of war, right? The god of war, he's the scar face. We know that Mars has a scar. That has to mean that those people knew something cosmologically was going on. There's your evidence. There's your proof. Okay. So what are you going to do from now on? You're going to exchange the word God with the word planet. And then read the story and then see where it takes you.